Hello, and welcome to episode 18 of Take Charge of the Classroom, a web series designed to disrupt outdated behavior management models and help you create the classroom culture of your dreams. In this episode, we are looking at making meaning, how we can make learning stickier, because if we can make learning stickier, it is much easier for recall and students can access it when they need it in the future, like for a test or to solve a new problem. In the big picture, this is our third time through the Take Charge model. The first time we looked at teacher through the teacher lens, the second time through the student lens. Now we're looking at the task and the responsibility lens. So what are the students doing? So this is the E, engage, in the Take Charge model. So specifically, how can we get the students, when they engage in their learning, how can we get them to make meaning? Because at the end of the day, really, that's what we want in schools. All of this behavior management, all of this creating the classroom culture of our dreams, all has one goal in mind, right? To help students learn, to help students apply what they learn, and ultimately to help them achieve. And so if we can't ever touch that, then this is an incomplete model. So let's look at how we can engage students by helping them make meaning and increasing their learning and their recall. So what is sticky learning? So what does that term mean? Well, there is some learning that is stickier than others. And all of the sticky learning activities and the sticky learning tasks, they all have a few things in common. So one is they include multiple memory tags. They're multimodal. So we're not just looking at pure visual. We're not just looking at pure auditory. We are looking at multiple senses being used. So imagine just giving a lecture to students. No notes, no visuals, no nothing. You're just lecturing. So everything that they're getting from you is pure auditory. And so they're filing it in their auditory systems of their brains. But what if you were to show some slides or some pictures at the same time? So now you are giving them a way to access what they're learning, either through their auditory memory tags or through their visual memory tags. And then what if they were to touch something? What if they had some type of handout, or maybe they had some type of makeable, right? Like a foldable, a make and take, something that they're doing throughout the lesson. So now you've got a kinesthetic memory tag, visual and auditory. And what if halfway through the lesson you stop and you ask them a question, they're supposed to turn and talk to a friend about something that they just learned. So now there's going to be some type of experiential memory, right? So now there's going to be some emotions involved because they enjoyed talking with this person, or they didn't like talking to that person, or that person said something funny. You see how you keep adding on these layers to make learning more and more active. And the more active we make it, the more memory tags we're going to add to it. Because when we're asking students to recall this memory, the more tags we initially put into the initial encoding, the easier it's going to be for recall. All learning needs to be connected to prior learning. When we learn something new, it doesn't just float around in our brain. It's always linked to something, and it's linked to prior learning. What we can do as educators is to make that connection explicit, right? We can actively talk about, well, this is like what we just learned. So sometimes we just launch into new learning, and we don't do a good enough job of connecting it. And then when we ask students to recall it later, they have difficulty or they can't do it at all because it never had anywhere to land. Where is that memory supposed to be sitting in the brain? Because when brains make memories, they link it to prior learning. Some students make the connections themselves, and that's great. They can recall it later. But for some students, if it seems just like a random bit of information, then they've got nothing to tag it into, or nothing to tie it into. So make your connections to prior learning explicit, right? Even if it seems like it should be obvious, make it explicit. What we're learning today is connected to what we learned last week. Or maybe you can ask students to make the connections verbal, right? Make that a class activity. One way or the other, make it very explicit. And then it's always helpful to not just give individual factoids, right? Include the larger narrative, include the big picture. When students can make mental models in their brains, when they can organize, classify, when they can see the system, then it's easier for them to put smaller component parts together. So don't focus so much on the minor detail. Help them see the bigger picture, how it all fits together. And then, as mentioned in the original example, active participation, right? Because when students are just sitting passively, you're just hoping that the visual and the auditory is going to get it done. When students are actively engaged, when they're active in their learning, so they're making something, they're doing something, they're working on something, they're talking about something, you're going to get so many more memory tags that way, because they're accessing and they're using a lot of their minds, they're using a lot of their emotions, and emotions are great for memory. In fact, if it's something is not tied to an emotion, it's going to be very hard to recall. So we want them to have fun. We want them to laugh. We want there to be just a general feeling of warmth and happiness, because that will really, really help the memory being recalled later. So sticky learning has these attributes. Reflection is a very, very powerful tool. Helping students to reflect on learning, it involves multiple things, as you see here: recall, elaboration, generation, and some type of output. So a simple task is, at the end of a lesson, have students reflect on the learning outcome, the learning objective that's up on the board. Have they hit that objective? If not, how close are they? If so, how do they know? But ask them to start doing that processing, to reflect. Or maybe it's a more simple reflection on how much they think they've learned that day. Write down 2 things, maybe talk to a friend about something. Or you can even have a reflection with a forward slant of, all right, we've been reviewing for our Chapter 8 test. We know that's coming up tomorrow. Take a moment to think about all that we've learned this week. How do you think you're going to do? And why do you think you're going to get the grade that you think you're going to get? But asking students to stop and reflect, rather than going 100 miles an hour all the time, stop every once in a while, reflect on what they've learned, what they'd still like to learn, what they're still interested in. That is going to be huge, because that act of going back and thinking about the things they've already learned and maybe some gaps, that adds new memory tags, and that's very active. That's a very active type of learning. And then hopefully we would get some type of output, right? So a lot of times it's just going to be verbal. Maybe they'll write something in a journal. They're not just going to cognate on it, they're going to do something with it. But that type of reflection is fantastic, and it's really easy. You can get in and out of it in 2 minutes. It's not going to take an entire task. And quite honestly, it could be a really great homework assignment, right? So rather than doing 10 problems, you can give students a choice. Would you want to do these 10 problems for homework? Or you have the choice of writing a 4-sentence paragraph on reflecting on what you learned today. Or why do you think this lesson was important? Or maybe asking them to reflect on the lesson and connecting it. Maybe they have to explicitly connect it to prior learning, and you can put some qualifications on that reflection so that it's not just 2 words. But that would be an easy homework assignment, and quite honestly would require a little bit more work for some students than the 10 problems, but some of them might think it's easier and they might jump on it. But reflection is very powerful. So how do we do sticky teaching? If sticky learning is fantastic, what does sticky teaching look like? Well, this is not an exhaustive list, but here are just a few ideas. So generation, you saw that mentioned on the previous slide. Generation is when you show students a problem and you ask them to generate a solution before you reveal the answer. Sometimes we are such spoilers as teachers. We want to relieve the cognitive load from them, and we show them a problem, and then we immediately show them how to do it. Let them generate a response. It's going to be ugly, it's going to be messy, and several people are probably going to be so far off that it's going to be laughable, right? If they knew how to do it, they wouldn't need you as a teacher. So you're not looking for perfection with generation. What you're looking is you're priming the pump. That's what you're looking to do. And if they try it and they're like, oh my gosh, this is hard, teacher. I don't know how to do it. I'm stuck. Then when you reveal the answer, trust me, you've got their attention, right? Then they'll be like, oh, I get it. But you have to let them generate something first. So don't always rush in with the correct answer, because then their brains might not be fertile enough soil for that seed of knowledge to really take root, right? You have to till the soil a little bit. That's what generation does. Let them work on it. Let them try. Let them struggle with it a little bit. Then reveal the answer. Error correction. A lot of teachers do this, but not nearly enough. Error correction of either their own errors, somebody else's errors, or that could be the problem itself, right? One of the easy way to help students really drill down to a very difficult elementary math concept, right? Subtracting across zeros. You practice, but holy cow, that is confusing for students. So after you've done it again and again and again, you think you've got it, show some incorrectly worked problems, right? And their task is to simply spot the error and then, write a quick explanation as to what they did wrong, right? Where was the mistake in the algorithm, and then how could they do it correct? But error correction, it's just a different way to teach if your particular discipline lends itself towards that, and it helps the students really apply what they've learned. Feedback. Any type of learning, especially if you're doing that generation, right? You don't want to just start with, hey, try to do this on your own, and you never give them the correct answer. Well, feedback is very important to learning, and a lot of teachers are very good with feedback. Just two things to remember with feedback. It needs to be positive. Negative feedback puts students back in the emotional parts of the brains you don't want them, and everything else you're going to say slides right off. So it needs to be positive feedback. So just negatively snipping at them, telling them this isn't good enough, you didn't do it right, that's going to just bring up a wall of emotions that you don't want to try to deal with. And it needs to be corrective. A check mark, an X, though that's not corrective feedback. That doesn't help anyone do anything. So it needs to be instructive and corrective, so it gives them enough information to correct their mistakes. And then mental models. We talked about getting the big picture and the larger narrative, but help students create mental models. Sometimes it's a graphic organizer, sometimes it's a visual diagram, but they need a mental model so they know where everything fits. How does everything relate to each other? There are a lot of times that there are so many component parts, they kind of lose the big picture and they can't see how everything is connected, right? So we as adults, as teachers, we have these mental models, we have the big picture. Show that to the students so they see how everything connects. And then, once again, prior knowledge. Accessing their prior knowledge is going to be very important. Ask them explicitly to just, instead of saying, oh, this connects to last week, maybe do a little intro and then stop and ask the students, what does this remind you of? Have you ever seen anything like this before? You might get some of the craziest answers, but you know what? If that's the connection for them, that's all you need. You just need some type of connection for them to put the new learning next to the prior knowledge, but specifically call that out and make that a part of the lesson. So there's an old saying, right, or an old question that if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it still make a noise? I would have a similar question. If a student learns something but can never remember it, has she really learned it, right? I would say that would be quote-unquote learning. Our students quote-unquote learn a lot, but if they can never remember it, they can never apply it for new problems, they can never apply it when they need to access it for a test, they never really learned it, right? You covered it, but they didn't learn it. How do we get them to learn it? That requires sticky teaching. And if we do the sticky teaching and the students really learn it, they're engaged, they're successful, and once again, guess what they don't have time for? Misbehavior, because they're having too much fun being successful. So thank you for joining me. As always, you can connect with me on the website, aarondaffern.com/takecharge. You can email me, or you can follow me at Aaron Daffern on Twitter.